the Affordable Health Care Act has helped millions of people, and it has lowered costs for healthcare across the board. But one study has shown that there is an expense that is starting to rise when it comes to the Affordable Health Care Act. And that's, of course, overhead costs. Now, this study basically shows that there will be $270 billion in new overhead costs. And this is for both private insurance companies and government programs. And according to the study, these costs will be, quote, over and above what would have been expected had the law not been enacted. And this is according to one of the authors of this study, David Himmelstein. Now, these costs, according to this study, will be particularly high in 2015 when overhead is expected to make up 45% of all federal spending related to the Affordable Care Act. Wow, that's really high. That's almost half overhead costs for all this federal spending. That's wow. Now, by 2022, that ratio is expected to decrease to about 20% of all federal spending related to the law. Now, the study used data from the government's National Health Expenditure Projections and the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office. And now, the interesting thing about this is that these authors are members of the Physicians for a National Health Program. Now, this group of physicians are campaigning and pushing for a single-payer healthcare system. And so, don't be surprised when I get to some of their positions later on in this article. Now, this number, writes Steffi Woolhandler, 22.5% of all new spending is going into overhead is shocking even to me, to be honest. It's almost 1 out of every $4 is just going to bureaucracy. Now, right-wingers would be like, oh, look at that. Inefficient bureaucracy, big government. That's why we should just repeal that Obamacare. Yeah, and suddenly I turn into a redneck. I don't know. Now, but this, according to this article, the study, it's not because of inefficient government bureaucracy, or I should say it's not just that, but it's inefficient corporate bureaucracy. She said private insurers have been expanding their administrative overhead despite some regulations from the Obama administration, to control those costs, such as, for example, the medical loss ratio. Now, that requires a certain amount of premium dollars that you pay into every month for your insurance to be spent on you instead of advertising. There's that law. That's why a lot of people have been receiving refunds from their health insurance companies, because they were using all that extra money, sometimes over half of what you pay in, for things like advertising and CEO bonuses. Now, this law, the Affordable Care Act says, well, you can't use that much. Okay? You have to use 80% of the premiums that your customers pay in to go to healthcare. Because that's what you pay in for. Not to pay in so some executive can buy another yacht, or an advertiser can get more advertising money. No, that's supposed to be for you. Well, some companies are saying, I don't really care about regulations. Fine me. Who cares? I'm going to still spend it on a yacht. Great. Now, for example, Steffi Woolhandler says, well, in order to control these costs, here's what we should do. Medicare for all. That's right. She argues that a better approach would be a type of Medicare for all system, and the extra administrative costs amount to the equivalent of $1,375 per newly insured person per year. Now, 2/3 of this cost of the new overhead are the result of rising enrollment in private insurance plans, which the authors say carries, quote, high costs for administration and profits. This is what happens when you have a for-profit healthcare system. They're going to say, well, we need administrators, for one, and we need a healthy profit margin. See, this is why critics from the left about the Affordable Health Care Act are absolutely right. This is why it's a giveaway to private insurance companies, because they're still allowing people to make profits off healthcare. Now, I believe healthcare is a human right. I believe everybody should be entitled to healthcare because it's a condition for survival. Okay? And if you don't believe that, you're kind of a dick, in my humble opinion. Okay? If you don't believe healthcare is a human right, or water is a human right, you're a dick. End of story. I'm not going to argue with you on this. Okay? I don't argue with dicks. I'm not the dick whisperer. Anyway. This, now, as I said, 2/3 of these new costs are from private plans, the private insurance companies, administration, and profits. The remaining 1/3 is through that inefficient government bureaucracy of the Medicaid expansion, as well as the cost of running these exchanges at both the federal and state levels. So here you have inefficient government bureaucracy actually costing less and making up less of this $270 billion expected overhead than so-called more efficient private for-profit healthcare insurance companies. Who is the bloated bureaucracy in this one? That's the question you need to ask. Who's the bloated bureaucracy here, right? Look, and government does it too. I'm not saying government can't get bloated with bureaucracy. Of course it can. And there are instances that you could point to where absolutely there is too much bureaucracy. But to say that business, and you hear this all the time for Republicans, to say that business always runs more efficiently, no, that is not the case. You know, you've got a lot of companies that will create mid-level management and layers of bureaucracy. And of course, once profit margins are threatened, those are the first ones usually to go. But when companies do make a lot of profit, and there's nothing wrong with that, there is a chance that they will create more bureaucracy. And that's why you always hear about companies trying to make their workforce leaner, because they run into that problem of, oh, right, yeah, we have too many mid-level managers. We have too many cooks in the kitchen. Essentially, we need to cut some of that out to make our force leaner, to actually make more money. Now, sometimes they'll do it in the worst way. For example, Carly Fiorina, presidential, long shot from the Republican side, cut so many jobs because she absolutely failed at doing her job. Now, when she was doing that as an attempt to make her company leaner, which didn't work, of course, after the disastrous merger. But I'm not going to really get into Carly Fiorina too much here. The point is that government can be bureaucratic. It can create too much bureaucracy, but so can the private market. And so really you have to watch out. And as far as healthcare goes, this is why we need to have a Medicare for all system. This is why we need to have single payer healthcare, because in this case, it is a lot more efficient than the private market. And since healthcare should be a human right, it makes sense to allow something that's not profit driven to be able to deliver that healthcare, that health insurance.